In today's podcast, we're going to talk about the health risk appraisal or risk stratification, or it's also called health risk assessment. And basically, what this is a series of tests, of we call field tests, that are administered by a personal trainer or a health coach or often a naturopath or almost anyone in the whole wellness and health and longevity continuum. It's basically our way of getting your baselines, figuring out what is the picture of health for you right now. Where are you doing particularly well? Like, what has your lifestyle led up to that's going really well for you that doesn't need so much attention? And where do we have deficits? Where do we have areas of your health, your wellness, your nutrition, your physicality, mobility, etc., that are in deficit and that really need some attention? And this is so critical. And I'm going to break down the 10 key things that I look for in just a moment. But this is so critical because when you think about what most people do, when they want to take on a healthier lifestyle or better exercise or nutrition, they just kind of dive in without having an understanding of what their deficits are. And if you don't know your deficits, you're going to end up just putting time into things that really aren't all that necessary. And you're going to just be spinning your wheels. You're not going to get that far. This is what most people do when they go to a fitness class or they download a meal plan that's just written for the public instead of for them, is they're not really playing to the deficits they have. And therefore, they're not really fixing and building up their body. So, with all that said, we'll get into it in just a moment. First, please click like and subscribe so that you can get more videos like this in the future and so more people can see this video in their algorithm. All right, that said, let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to give you my list of 10 key things that I'm looking for when I meet with a new prospect for the first time or when I'm reevaluating with a client months later to see where we're progressing and maybe where we're not progressing as quickly as we intend to. So the first item that we look for is pain. I'll ask a prospect to tell me about any kind of pain that they experience periodically. Oftentimes that's because a joint is damaged. Other times it's because we have significant muscle imbalances, where perhaps the joint itself is actually really working just fine, but the muscles themselves are out of alignment and they have the wrong strength ratio, and that can cause pain in the muscles and in the joint as well. And other times people don't even know when they have certain pain, and I have to put them through a whole movement screening. And a movement screening is basically where you're having all the joints perform their movement to a full normal range of motion. It should all be pain-free. If it's not, then we start investigating and try to figure out what's going on. Is it a bony spur or something that we can't necessarily address with exercise? Or is there, again, a muscle imbalance or something that's just out of whack and that can be corrected through corrective exercise? So that's one of the first things we look for is clearing tests and anything having to do with pain. Now, the next thing that we look for is the medical history. Now, medical history tells us a lot. This is where it's very important that if you do hire a coach, you want to be very honest about your entire medical history. Don't say to yourself that your asthma is no big deal and you're not going to worry about it, because that is something that it's going to come up at some point in your program. And we want to be sure we're addressing it with the right kinds of foods, with potentially the right supplements as well, and also with the right exercise. Very high intensity zone 4 and zone 5 cardio is too much early on in a program, especially for someone with any kind of bronchial problems or any history of COPD or asthma. On the other hand, if you've got perfectly clean, well-functioning lungs, it might make a little bit more sense to get into those zones relatively early in your program. So your exercise prescription and your meal plan really they're very much based on what your medical history has been. And I cannot stress that enough. The intensities, the durations, the rest periods, and all the parameters that go into your exercise are really all going to come from what that medical history is. All right, now we look at fitness tests. So now we're looking not just at your medical history, but at how effective and efficient your body is. And so we'll look at a VO2 test, all right, basically a test of your aerobic capacity. And there are so many different tests that can do this. There's the BYU jog test, which is a nice one. For many people, the step test is more appropriate. We have many, many different step tests where you're stepping up and down from a step device. And we're looking at how quickly your body recovers after a bout of stepping. And so there's just a ton of different tests, but they all boil down to the same key thing, and that's figuring out what your aerobic capacity is like. Now, to give you an idea of what that essentially is, if you wanted to figure out what your maximum bench press or your maximum squat was, like what's the most weight you could take on for a movement like that, that's kind of like what we're figuring out for your VO2, your aerobic capacity. We're figuring out what is its capacity, and that way we know where to go to a percentage of that capacity. So, for example, let's say someone's recovering from stroke or heart attack. They should only be training initially at around 40% or so of that capacity. So we have to know that capacity to figure out what their training should be like, what their heart rate should be like. That said, if someone's an athlete and they've got a great history of training 3 or 4 days a week, if we find that their capacity is, let's say, 15 METs, well, then okay, it makes sense to train them at a pretty high percentage of that because of their history. So that's why VO2 testing is so incredibly important. And also, this gives us a better picture in terms of what their future health outcomes look like. So, for example, if someone comes to me and I test them and I find their MET capacity is like 5 or 6 METs, that's really low, and that's suggestive that cardiovascular disease risk is very high. So I know in a case like that, that one of our top priorities is to increase their VO2, even if the client doesn't really care. If the client just says, no, I just want to look better, we still know that ultimately, if we're going to serve this person well for the long run, we need to improve their cardiovascular capacity for health and longevity, but also because we're going to need it in terms of burning more calories and getting them to be able to look better and to gain more muscle and lose fat as well. So VO2 testing, also very important. Now, moving on from there, we then talk about strength testing. Every single muscle in the body is probably going to need some conditioning. Some are going to need more stretching because they're too tight. Some are going to need no stretching and just lots of heavy strength training. It really just depends. We have to see how the muscles are performing, and we have to see also what kind of muscle imbalances that we have as well throughout the body and try to correct those and get them normalized. So strength testing, very important part of this whole thing. I'd suggest that if you go to a health coach who's not necessarily a personal trainer, they're going to spend a little bit less time on this because it's not necessarily in their vernacular quite as much. But I do suggest overall, you want to have something of a regular strength assessment going forward in life because it is so darn important. It's a great way to mitigate your risk of disease, of arthritis, and all kinds of health problems as you get older. All right, so that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next item. This one's a flexibility test. Now, I spoke a bit about this already, but if you have muscles that are too tight, we need to be able to know about that and address them. If they're only a little bit tight and it doesn't seem like a situation that's going to get considerably worse due to lifestyle, for example, let's say your biceps are just a little bit tight, lifestyle is probably not going to make that a whole lot worse, so that may be a lower priority. I wouldn't sound the alarm and tell a client with slightly tight biceps that we got to fix this right away. It's probably not as important as other issues in their life and for their longevity. That said, let's say someone's got very tight pectoralis muscles to the point where their humeral heads here, the arms are being pulled forward and it's noticeable. That's pretty serious. That is only going to worsen over time, especially if they spend a lot of their day sitting. So in a case like that, I would say that's usually going to be a pretty high priority unless they've got very major medical issues that are much bigger. So this helps a coach and helps you to figure out how much attention to put on certain issues like tight muscles. Like I said, sometimes they're not so important, sometimes they're very important. Okay, now moving on to a more nutritional component here is the omega-3 intake. I talk a lot about this in all my videos. Omega-3 is very scientifically understood, and yet we don't really talk much about it in the health and wellness spectrum, but we should be, because getting the right dose of omega-3 is tremendous. Getting too little omega-3 is responsible for at least 100,000 to 200,000 deaths annually in the United States alone. All right, so it's almost on par, like when you look at people who die from alcohol or cigarette abuse. This isn't that much lower than those total deaths from substance abuse. And yet no one ever talks about, hey, your omega-3s are too low. Doctors don't think twice about it. It just doesn't come into the conversation much, and it should. Now, protein is another nutrient that most people are very deficient in. The RDA for protein, the recommended daily allowance, is very low. It's enough to sustain life and just get you by. But if you're concerned about longevity, staying out of the hospital, off of medications, feeling great, moving great in your 70s, your 80s, and beyond, then you certainly want to get a much higher dose of protein than what the RDA suggests. Most people do not. And long story short, if you're shy on protein intake, you're almost certainly shy on muscle mass. And I've spoken a lot in my other videos as well. Muscle mass is really something of a panacea. When you have a good amount of healthy muscle tissue on your body and you're maintaining it, you really do well in terms of blood pressure, in terms of longevity, heart health, mobility, keeping healthy posture and balance. I mean, just so many components really come down to having a good amount of muscle tissue that's firing well and working well in your body. So protein, also very, very important. If I find that someone is deficient in protein, I'm pretty quick to start working on their meal planning so that we can start incorporating more of it. Total calories also go into this discussion as well. Of course, we do want to make sure that the total calories coming into a person each day do not exceed the total calories going out between their metabolism, their activities of their daily activities, and also their exercise as well. So if the total calories coming in, of course, exceed those numbers, then certainly that means we're going to have something of a weight problem at some point if we don't already. So those also need addressing. Now, my number 8th item here is things like smoking and substance abuse, alcohol, and even junk food I would put there. This is where, we can't try to take someone who is moderately healthy and then try to make them maximally healthy overnight. That's not going to work. Whatever lifestyle change that we incorporate has to be sustainable and still has to be something that the person ultimately wants to do. So if someone does smoke, we can't necessarily just say, all right, all smoking's got to be gone. Or if someone's a drinker, we're not necessarily going to say no alcohol. But we want to at least try to look at their medical history, look at their lifestyle, look at what's going on, and try to get a picture of how destructive are these negative habits right now. If it's a very occasional cigarette and just a little bit of alcohol here and there, but overwhelmingly we have very positive habits, yeah, that might be a fair enough trade to be sustainable for this person. So you're not taking away things that they really enjoy. That said, if junk food is going on each and every day in high quantities and it's a fairly high percentage of their caloric intake, obviously that's too much. So this is where a good coach can really help you to mitigate and navigate and also start to do some cognitive restructuring too, to try to minimize or work these things out of your life potentially for good. All right, so now let's move on to my number 9th item out of 10, and that's stress management. This is a different one than everything else here because it's so psychological, right? Stressors, when they're emotional, is one thing, but as they become more chemical and more physiological, that becomes another, right? If you've ever seen like your heart rate starts to really climb, or you almost start to perspire or shake because you're so sad or so angry or going through some kind of emotional turmoil, that's really serious on the body. That shortens telomere lengths, which have so much to do with longevity. It is certainly bad for your heart. It's bad for your nervous system. It's bad for you. So with stress management, we can't really just throw a simple exercise at it so much. That takes a little bit more of mental restructuring and looking at life and looking at stressors in a slightly different way. For some programs, that's a really small part, if any. And in other cases, it's a huge part of what needs to be done to help get someone healthy. In some cases, stress management is more important than, say, getting off smoking or losing 60 pounds of excess body fat or with someone who has no muscle tone on them whatsoever. And then we were trying to gain muscle back. There are cases where stress management is the biggest priority. So again, the health risk assessment helps us to figure out where does that fall in terms of our total health risk. What's this going to lead to in terms of longevity and staying out of the hospital as we get older? The final item I have here is hydration. There are some tools that can help us do this, but it's a really good idea to figure out how well hydrated someone is on an average given day. My experience is a lot of people are very up and down. They have a really good day and then a really bad one. That's pretty dangerous as well. But you certainly do want to get some idea of how much water is coming in and is it appropriate for your body weight, your activities, for the environment that you're usually in. A lot of factors go into this, and many people are chronically dehydrated. Every part of your body needs water. So if your body is short on water, if it is in a chronic state of dehydration, it's fair to say you're not building health very effectively. Anyway, everybody, I hope this video has been helpful in giving you a good idea of how a health risk assessment works, what the merit is of having one done, and certainly where you can get this total picture, like I explained here, of where you're headed in life, like what your current lifestyle is doing for you, where you're being productive and where you're not being so productive. So anyway, if you have questions, please be sure to comment down below. You can also call me. I've got my phone number in the description, and you can visit my websites as well. Those are also in the description. I've also got some free stuff in the description as well. I've got some questionnaires that you can complete if you want to get my input in terms of your relationship with food, your relationship with exercise, the methods you're using in weight loss. All that stuff is there in the description. So please grab onto any of that and let me know if you'd like my help. I look forward to your health and wellness success. Thanks, everybody.